I should have died on day one. But the Emperor had other plans for me, or perhaps the machine gods simply hadn't finished with my suffering yet. They told me command of a Leman Russ was an honor, a promotion earned through 20 years of gunnery service in the Imperial Guard. What they didn't tell me was that inside that rolling cathedral of ceramite and steel, you don't live, you endure. You survive in increments, measured by the span between one shell impact and the next, between the moment your driver's station stops screaming and when you realize he's been dead for 3 hours, but the servitor Link kept his corpse moving the control levers anyway. My name was Commander Thaddeus Crane, and I lasted 40 days inside the command cupola of Imperator's Fist, a Leman Russ battle tank of the 19th Paragonian Armored Regiment. 40 days on a world whose name I never learned, fighting an enemy whose faces I never saw clearly through the vision blocks. 40 days breathing recycled air that tasted like copper and promethium, feeling every impact transmitted through the tank's frame into my spine, listening to my crew break down one synapse at a time while I held together long enough to call fire missions and watch the chrono tick toward dawn. They pulled me out on day 41. By then, I'd forgotten what sunlight felt like on skin that wasn't covered in chemical burns. By then I'd stopped being Thaddeus entirely and had become simply the voice that spoke coordinates, the hand that approved main gun solutions, the presence in the cupola that the crew below needed to believe was still human enough to lead them. This is what they don't tell you at the Schola Progenium when they show you the propaganda reels of tanks advancing in perfect formation across pristine battlefields. This is what the recruitment sermons skip when they promise glory in service to the Golden Throne. A Leman Russ isn't a chariot of war, it's a coffin that moves, and command means you get to choose which of your crew dies first when the choices run out. The smell hit me first, even before I'd climbed into the cupola for the first time. Every tank has its own signature, a mixture of promethium fumes, lubricant oil, spent shell casings, human sweat, and something else, something organic and wrong that you can never quite identify. Imperator's Fist smelled like burnt hair and copper, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. I learned later that sweetness came from the previous commander, parts of whom were still welded into the metal where the last blast had flash-cooked him to the interior hull plating. The tech priests had cleaned what they could reach, but in a Leman Russ there are spaces between the armor layers where nothing human-sized can fit. The maintenance servitors had simply painted over the rest. "She's a good tank, sir," Sergeant Varn had said, his weathered face splitting into what might have been a smile beneath his rebreather. "Kills everything she points at. Just don't touch the left side of the cupola near the vision block. Gets hot for no reason the engineers can explain." I touched it anyway. That first day, before we'd even rolled to the staging area. The metal was warm, almost body temperature, in a tank that had been powered down for 6 hours. When I pulled my hand away, my palm tingled like I'd touched something electric. Varn saw my expression and shrugged. Previous commander touched it every day. Said it brought luck. He died with his hand on that spot when the shot came through. Varn tapped his rebreather, adjusting the fit. I figure his luck ran out. But the heat stayed. That should have been my first warning. The Imperium doesn't believe in ghosts, only in machine spirits, servitor patterns, and the Emperor's divine will. But a tank remembers. Metal holds memory in ways the Mechanicus won't discuss in their catechisms. Every crew that dies inside a Leman Russ leaves something behind, pressed into the steel like a fingerprint on soft clay. We rolled out at 0400 on day 1, part of a company strength column advancing toward an objective. The commissars identified only as Strategic Position Gamma 7. 20 tanks moving in staggered formation across terrain that looked like someone had taken a hive city, chewed it up, and spit it out across 50 kilometers of ash-gray landscape. The sky was the color of old bruises, pregnant with chemical clouds that occasionally wept acid rain. The ground crunched under our treads, not dirt, but pulverized rockcrete, mixed with bone fragments and shell casings from previous battles. Inside the cupola, I had 8 vision blocks giving me a fragmented view of the world, forward, left, right, rear, and oblique angles that never quite showed you what you needed to see. Everything outside came to me filtered through scratched armor glass and the green tint of the targeting overlay. The Vox crackled constantly with reports, coordinates, warnings that came 3 seconds too late to matter. Below me, in the fighting compartment, Gunner Merrick sat hunched over his targeting station, his face lit by the dim glow of the Auspex screen. Loader Dace moved through the cramped space with the efficiency of long practice, handling shells that weighed as much as a small child. In the driver's compartment, separated from us by a bulkhead that might as well have been a wall between worlds, Driver Kells controlled our 60-ton Destiny with levers and pedals, seeing the world through a vision slit so narrow it was like viewing reality through a mail slot. We'd gone perhaps 10 kilometers when the first impacts started. Not aimed at us specifically, random artillery fire, the kind that turns the air itself into shrapnel. Through the vision blocks I watched a shell land 30 meters to our right, and the tank adjacent to us, Throne's Vengeance, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, keeping formation, its commander visible in his cupola scanning the horizon. The next moment there was a flash bright enough to white out my vision blocks, a pressure wave that made Imperator's fist rock on its suspension, and when my vision cleared, there was only a crater where 30 tons of Imperial war machine had been. All call signs, maintain formation, the Vox barked. Continue advance. Artillery is not concentrated. Acceptable losses. Acceptable. I keyed my Vox, confirmed the order, and kept scanning the horizon, while below me, Merrick muttered prayers to the Omnissiah, and Dace checked and rechecked the shell racks, making sure nothing had shaken loose when the blast wave hit us. In the driver's compartment, Kells said nothing. He never said much. Later I would understand why. The heat inside the tank climbed as the day wore on. Leman Russ tanks aren't climate-controlled, they're designed for functionality, not comfort. The engine roars behind a bulkhead that's never quite thick enough, radiating heat that turns the crew compartment into an oven. The air recyclers wheeze and grind, moving the same stale atmosphere in circles, filtering out the worst of the fumes, but never quite eliminating the taste of promethium that coats the back of your throat. By hour 3 of the advance, sweat was running down my back in rivers, pooling at the base of my spine where the command seat's worn padding provided no absorption. My uniform clung to me like a second skin. I could feel salt crystals forming where the fabric chafed. Contact, 10 o'clock, infantry formation. Merrick's voice came through the internal Vox, calm and professional. His targeting display fed information to my cupola repeater, red icons blooming on the green screen, heat signatures that might have been human or might have been something else wearing human shape. Range? I asked, already knowing the answer from the display but needing to hear it confirmed, needing to maintain the protocols that kept us functioning as a crew rather than 4 individuals sealed in separate metal boxes. 800 meters and closing. They're in the open, sir. No cover. I looked through the forward vision block, saw nothing but ash and broken terrain, then checked the targeting display again. The heat signatures were real, moving in a loose skirmish line toward our column. Suicide troops or zealots, probably. The kind the enemy sent forward to waste our ammunition and test our response times. Main gun, load high explosive. Merrick, target the center of their formation. Fire when ready. Below me, Dace moved with practiced efficiency, the clang of the shell being rammed home resonating through the tank's frame. Loaded. On target, Merrick confirmed. A pause, barely a heartbeat. Firing. The main gun's recoil was something you felt in your bones. The entire tank rocked back on its suspension, the roar contained but still deafening even through the insulated crew compartment. Through the vision block I saw the shells impact a brief flower of orange flame, earth and bodies lifting into the air. The targeting display showed heat signatures winking out, disappearing from existence. "Target destroyed," Merrick reported, his voice still level, as though he'd just completed a drill at the practice range rather than erasing human beings from reality. "Reload, high explosive, maintain awareness." I keyed the company Vox. "Contact destroyed, continuing advance." The Vox crackled acknowledgement from the company commander, and we kept rolling. Behind us, the crater where those infantry had been would be just another pockmark on a landscape already scarred beyond recognition. In a week, no one would remember they'd existed. In a month, I wouldn't remember I'd given the order that killed them. That was day 1. Hour 4 of day 1. The moment I learned the first rule of tank command: you don't kill people inside a Leman Russ. You approve targeting solutions. You authorize main gunfire. The people dying in front of your guns aren't people anymore. They're heat signatures, threat indicators, objectives to be neutralized. The moment you start seeing them as people, the moment you start remembering they have names and families and lives that extend beyond the 800 meters between your gun and their position, you stop being able to function. You freeze. And in a tank, freezing means dying. They didn't teach that at the Scholar. They taught tactics, gunnery tables, mechanical operations, command protocols. They taught you how to read a topographic map and how to request artillery support and how to coordinate with infantry elements. What they didn't teach was how to split yourself into pieces: the piece that gives orders, the piece that observes, and the piece that used to be human but can't afford to remember that anymore. We made contact 7 more times that first day. Twice with infantry formations that dissolved under our main guns and sponson bolters. 3 times with enemy armor lighter vehicles that didn't stand a chance against our battle cannon but still tried, still fired, still died in brilliant flashes that left after images burned into my retinas. Once with something the Auspex couldn't identify. Heat signatures that moved wrong and died screaming over the Vox frequencies in voices that made Merrick vomit into his rebreather. And once with nothing at all, just a feeling, a certainty that made me order the tank to halt and traverse the turret left 30 degrees and fire into apparently empty terrain, revealing the camouflaged position only when our shell turned concealment into corpses. "Good eye, Commander," Vaughn said over the internal Vox, and I almost told him it wasn't my eye, wasn't my decision, that something had whispered the coordinates into my ear from the warm spot on the cupola's left side. But I didn't, because that would have been admitting something neither the commissariat nor the Mechanicus would forgive. By nightfall we'd advanced 23 kilometers and lost 6 tanks from the company. Acceptable losses, according to the mission parameters. We established a Lager position in the remains of what might once have been a municipal water treatment facility, parking in a defensive circle with overlapping fields of fire. The other commanders climbed out of their cupolas to stretch, to breathe air that wasn't filtered through recyclers, to see the sky without the tint of armor glass distorting everything into shades of green. I stayed in my cupola, partly because doctrine required 1 crew member to maintain watch at all times, mostly because I'd spent 12 hours inside that metal coffin, and the thought of climbing out, of exposing myself to the open air, felt wrong. The cupola was hot, cramped, stank of my own sweat, and the copper hair smell that never quite faded. But it was also safe, defined. The vision blocks gave me a world I could understand, reduced to 8 narrow windows and a targeting display. Outside, the world was too big, too open, too full of variables my training hadn't prepared me to process. "Sir?" Vaughn's voice came through the crew compartment hatch. "You should rotate out. Get some rations. Check the crew." "In a minute," I said, knowing I wouldn't, knowing that a minute was a lie I'd tell myself until dawn made the decision irrelevant. My hand rested on the warm spot on the cupola's left side, and the heat pulsed like a heartbeat. Below me, I could hear the crew moving through their maintenance routines, Merrick cleaning the breach mechanism with an obsessiveness that bordered on ritual, Dace reorganizing the shell racks, counting and recounting rounds with whispered prayers, Kells in his driver's compartment, so quiet I sometimes forgot he was there at all, performing whatever maintenance drivers do in that isolated forward space. The night passed in watch rotations that blurred together. The sky never got properly dark. Chemical clouds reflected the glow from distant fires, turning everything into perpetual twilight. Other tanks in the Leger maintained engine idle, the rumble creating a white noise that should have been comforting but instead felt like the breathing of some vast predator. I dozed in the command seat, head lolling against the cupola's padding, jerking awake every few minutes to scan the vision blocks and confirm we weren't under attack. At some point, 0200 according to the chrono, though time had stopped feeling real, I heard weeping. Quiet, muffled, the sound of someone trying desperately not to be heard. It took me several minutes to locate the source, the driver's compartment. Kells was crying, had been crying perhaps for hours, his body shaking with silent sobs, in that cramped forward space where he sat, surrounded by control levers and the narrow vision slit that showed him nothing but darkness and terrain. Kells, I said into the internal vox, knowing he could hear me even if he didn't respond. Status report. The weeping stopped. For a long moment there was only silence then. Vehicle is operational. Commander, no issues to report. His voice was steady, professional, completely at odds with what I'd just heard. Do you require movement? Negative. Maintain position. I should have said something else. Should have acknowledged what I'd heard. Should have asked if he needed to rotate out or talk to the company medicae. But I didn't, because in a tank there are no emotions, only operational status. You're functional, or you're not. Everything else is irrelevant noise that interferes with combat effectiveness. I heard him shift in his compartment, heard the leather of his seat creak. The weeping didn't resume. For the rest of the night I listened to his breathing over the vox, steady and controlled, and wondered what he saw through that narrow vision slit in the darkness, what he'd seen during the 12 hours of advance that had broken something inside him that he could only express when he thought no one was listening. Day 2 began at 0500, when the company vox crackled to life with movement orders. We rolled out of the Leger into morning twilight that looked exactly like evening twilight, which had looked exactly like afternoon light. The chemical clouds, permitting no real day, no real night, just variations of gray that made time itself feel negotiable. The objective was another 20 kilometers forward, following a supply route that had been a highway once, before the war had chewed it into broken chunks of rockcrete and crater-pocked ash. We advanced in column, more vulnerable than line formation but faster, command gambling that speed mattered more than dispersal. Through my vision blocks I watched the landscape scroll past, burned-out vehicles, their identities long since erased by fire and time, standing like monuments to forgotten battles, crater fields that stretched to the horizon, so dense they overlapped, creating a moonscape of interlocking bowls, structures that might have been buildings or might have been geological formations, so heavily damaged that function and origin had become meaningless. Movement, 3 o'clock, low. Merrick's call snapped my attention to the targeting display. Heat signatures, small and fast, moving through the rubble paralleling our advance. Could be recon elements, or hunter-killer teams. Traverse right, load high explosive. Varn, get the sponson bolter on that bearing. I keyed the company vox. Contact right. Possible anti-tank teams, engaging. The turret whined as it rotated. Merrick and Dace, working in synchronization below me. The sponson bolter opened up, Varn firing controlled bursts at shapes I couldn't quite resolve through the vision blocks. Tracers walked across the rubble, disappearing into shadows. Something exploded not large enough to be a vehicle, possibly an ammunition carrier or a prepared charge. Target unclear, Merrick reported. Can't get a clean lock. Fire into the general area, 3 rounds high explosive, walk them in. The first shell landed 30 meters beyond the heat signatures. The second was short by 10. The third was dead center. And through the vision blocks I saw human shapes, definitely human, now tumbling through the air like ragdolls. The targeting display showed heat signatures scattering, fading, disappearing into the rubble. Target suppressed, I reported, continuing advance. But something was wrong. The heat signatures hadn't moved right. Infantry under fire, scatter, seek cover, return fire, or retreat. These had moved toward us, directly toward us, even as the shells were falling. And when they died, the targeting display had shown something odd, a brief flash of heat much hotter than human body temperature, like small fires igniting where the bodies fell. Merrick, did you see that temperature spike? Affirmative, sir. Might have been carrying incendiaries or explosives, or... He paused, and I heard the uncertainty in his voice. Or they were already burning when we hit them. Already burning. The phrase hung in the air between us, unspoken implications spreading like ripples. The enemy on this world was known to use chemical weapons, incendiaries, strategies that prioritized inflicting maximum suffering over tactical efficiency. But troops who were already burning, who still advanced through artillery fire. Keep scanning, I ordered. All sectors. Report anything unusual. Sir, Vaughn said from his sponson position. Define unusual. It was almost a joke. Almost. Because on this world, on day 2 of 40, we were still clinging to the idea that there were standards, that there were lines between normal combat horror and something else, that the enemy fought with recognizable tactics, using recognizable weapons for recognizable objectives. By day 10, we would abandon those comfortable lies, but on day 2, we still had hope. The advance continued. More contacts, more fire missions, more heat signatures turning cold on the targeting display. By midday, insofar as we could tell time in the perpetual twilight, we'd burned through a third of our ammunition load. The inside of the tank had become a sauna, temperature climbing past 40 degrees, as the sun somewhere above the chemical clouds reached its zenith. Sweat ran down my face, stinging my eyes, pooling in my boots. The copper hair smell intensified, mixed now with the cordite reek from fired shells and the acrid tang of hot metal. Dace collapsed first. I heard the clatter below me, the sound of a body hitting the deck plates, and keyed the internal vox. Loader status? Loader status. He's down, Merrick reported, his own voice strained. Heat exhaustion, I think. He's still breathing but unresponsive. Vaughn, rotate into the fighting compartment. Take over loading duties. Merrick, maintain gunnery station. The tank rolled to a halt while Vaughn squeezed through the narrow passage from his sponson to the main compartment. Through the vision blocks I saw the rest of the column continuing to advance, leaving us stationary, vulnerable. Standard doctrine. A tank stops, it becomes a target. A tank falls out of formation, it dies alone. Sir, the company's pulling ahead, Merrick said, unnecessary observation, stating what I could see through the vision blocks. I'm aware. Get that loader station operational. Dace needs medical attention. He needs us to not die in the next 30 seconds while we're sitting still in an active combat zone, I snapped. Vaughn, are you in position? In position, Commander, Vaughn confirmed, his voice tight. Loader's station is operational, but Dace will receive attention once we're back in formation. Kells, advance at maximum sustainable speed, catch the column. All stations, maintain awareness. The tank lurched forward, treads grinding against broken rockcrete. In the fighting compartment below me, Vaughn would be pulling Dice's unconscious body out of the way, jamming him into the narrow space between the shell racks and the turret basket, where he'd cook further in the radiant heat from the engine but at least wouldn't interfere with combat operations. Necessary, pragmatic, the kind of decision that kept tanks fighting and crews operational, the kind of decision that meant I'd stopped seeing Dace as a person and started seeing him as equipment malfunction to be worked around. We caught the column 15 minutes later, slotting back into formation as though nothing had happened. No one commented on our brief absence. The Vox maintained its constant chatter of coordinates and contact reports, and I resumed my position in the command cupola, hands on the controls, eyes on the vision blocks, that part of me that used to feel sympathy for injured crew members locked away somewhere deep where it couldn't interfere with operational effectiveness. My hand found the warm spot on the cupola's left side, and the heat pulsed with something like approval. That night, in our second lager, the company Medicaid checked Dace over and pronounced him fit for duty after enforced hydration and a stim injection that would keep his heart racing for the next 6 hours. Dace climbed back into the tank with eyes that didn't quite focus and hands that trembled when they touched the shells. But he could load, and loading was all that mattered. "He's not right," Vaughn said to me, voice low enough that Dace couldn't hear in the fighting compartment below. "That stim injection. It's keeping him functional, but he's not tracking properly. You can see it in his eyes." "Can he perform his duties?" I asked. "For now. But sir, if we keep pushing like this, we push until the objective is taken or we're relieved or we're dead. Those are the only options." I checked the chrono. 2,300 hours, 3 hours, until my next watch rotation. "Get some rest." "That's an order." Vaughn looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not insubordination, nothing that would require correction, just a recognition, a understanding that the commander he'd known for 2 days was being replaced by something else, something that sounded like me and gave orders like me, but had stopped processing crew members as people and started processing them as equipment with operational parameters. He climbed down from the cupola without another word. I sat alone in the command seat, listening to the night sounds of the Leger engines idling, sentries moving between tanks, the occasional crack of distant weapons fire that might have been real or might have been echoes carrying across the wasteland. The warm spot on the cupola's left side pulsed against my palm, and I felt something like presence there, like I wasn't quite alone even though the cupola held only me. "Who were you?" I whispered to the metal, knowing I wouldn't get an answer, not expecting one. But the metal warmed further, and in that warmth I felt something like recognition, something like welcome, something like inevitability. The previous commander had touched this spot every day, Vaughn had said, for luck. But perhaps it wasn't luck he'd been seeking. Perhaps it was simply acknowledgement from the thing that lived in the tank's memory, the accumulated presence of all the previous crews who'd died inside this rolling metal cathedral. Perhaps he'd been asking the same question I was asking now. "Will you remember me when I'm gone?" The answer, I was learning, was yes. The tank remembers. The metal holds memory. And when you command a Leman Russ, you're not just leading a crew. You're joining a lineage of ghosts pressed into steel. Day 3 brought fog, or what passed for fog on this chemical-poisoned world. Grey tendrils that reduced visibility to 50 meters, that turned the targeting display into a confused hash of heat blooms and false returns, that transformed the advance into a blind crawl through hostile terrain where anything could be waiting just beyond the vision block's limited range. "All call signs, maintain formation," the company Vox ordered. "Speed reduction to 5 kilometers per hour. Increase scanning protocols. Watch for ambush. 5 kilometers per hour. Walking pace. Every commander's nightmare, moving slowly enough that you couldn't maneuver, couldn't use speed for protection, but still moving, still committed to advance rather than defending from prepared positions. It was the tactical equivalent of walking naked through a room full of razor wire, hoping you wouldn't brush against anything sharp. "This is wrong," Merrick said over the internal vox, his voice carrying the edge of fear he'd kept suppressed for 3 days. "Sir, this is exactly the kind of situation where we get..." The impact cut him off. Not on us, on the tank, 3 positions ahead in the column. Through the fog, I saw the muzzle flash, heard the thundercrack of main gunfire that wasn't ours, watched the forward tank brew up in a column of flame that briefly illuminated the fog from within. The turret separated from the hull, rising perhaps 10 meters into the air before tumbling back down with a crash that I felt through Imperator's fist's deck plating. Contact front. The vox erupted with multiple voices, all trying to report simultaneously. Enemy armor, range unknown, position, another flash, another tank dying. This one was behind us, bracketing the column, trapping us between known enemies forward and rear. All call signs, return fire. Main guns engage targets of opportunity. Spread formation. I keyed the internal vox. Merrick. Scan forward. Anything that looks like a target. Fire. Dace. Load anti-tank rounds. Cycle through the magazine. Kells. Left oblique. Get us out of the column alignment. The tank pivoted, treads grinding as Kells executed the maneuver. Through the vision blocks I saw nothing but fog and shadows. The targeting display showing heat blooms everywhere and nowhere. The Auspex screen a useless hash of conflicting returns. We were firing blind, hoping to suppress enemy fire through volume rather than accuracy. "I don't have a target," Merrick said, desperation creeping into his voice. "The Auspex is showing there's nothing there, sir. There's no clean return." Then fire into the fog, full spread, traverse left to right, 3 rounds high explosive followed by 2 armor piercing. Walk the shots across the most likely ambush positions. "But sir, we can't confirm." "Fire." The tank rocked with each shot. The main gun's recoil transmitted through the frame into my bones. Somewhere in the fog, our shells were landing, possibly hitting enemy positions, possibly hitting nothing but terrain. The other tanks in the company were doing the same, creating a wall of suppressing fire that turned the fog orange with muzzle flashes and shell impacts. And then, for just a moment, the fog cleared. Not everywhere, just a gap, a window perhaps 20 meters wide, perfectly positioned to show me what had been waiting in ambush. They weren't tanks, or they had been tanks, once, before they'd become something else. Hulls twisted into shapes that hurt to look at, turrets that rotated the wrong way, metal that seemed to breathe, and painted on their sides, symbols that my eyes refused to properly process, designs that seemed to crawl across the armor plating like living things. "Emperor preserve us," Vaughn whispered over the vox. The fog closed again before I could respond, before I could give orders, before I could do anything except feel my lunch rising in my throat and fight to keep my hand steady on the control that would key the company vox. Because I knew, in that moment of clarity, that we hadn't been ambushed by the enemy. We'd been ambushed by something that had once been Imperial armor, tanks that had fought too long on this world and been changed by it, crews that had become fused with their machines in ways the Mechanicus would call tech heresy, and the Inquisition would call something worse. "Sir?" Merrick's voice pulled me back. "Orders?" I swallowed bile, tasted copper, felt the warm spot on the cupola's left side burning against my palm like a brand. "Continue firing. Don't stop firing until we're clear of this engagement zone." "But we can't see." I said fire. For the next 20 minutes we fired blind into the fog, burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate while around us other tanks did the same. The vox filled with screaming, some of it coherent reports, most of it just noise, the sound of crews breaking under pressure they couldn't identify or quantify. Twice more the fog cleared enough to show glimpses of the things attacking us, and each time I saw more detail I wished I hadn't. Treads that moved like centipede legs, barrels that wept fluids that weren't oil, vision ports that glowed from within with light that cast no shadows. Then, As suddenly as it had started, the engagement ended. The hostile fire ceased. The fog began to lift, revealing a battlefield strewn with wrecks 8 from our company, but also 5 of the things that had ambushed us, their twisted hulls smoking with fires that burned colors fire shouldn't burn. All call signs, status report. The company commander's voice came through, remarkably steady for someone who'd just survived. Whatever we'd survived. Sound off. I gave our identification code, confirmed operational status despite ammunition depletion, listened to the ragged roll call from the surviving tanks. We'd lost 8, more than a third of our strength, gone in an engagement that had lasted less than half an hour. "Sir," Vaughn said from the fighting compartment, his voice careful, controlled, like he was handling explosives. "What were those things?" "Enemy armor," I replied. Automatic, the only acceptable answer. "That wasn't, sir. Those weren't enemy tanks. Those were our tanks. I saw Imperial identification codes on the hulls. I saw..." "You saw enemy armor," I repeated, harder this time. "Captured vehicles, modified for hostile use. That's what you saw. That's what you'll report if anyone asks. Understood?" A long pause. Then, "Understood, Commander." But we both knew I was lying. We both knew what we'd seen couldn't be explained by simple capture and modification. The Imperium's tanks don't transform like that, don't grow and change and breathe, unless the crew stays inside too long, unless the boundary between man and machine starts to dissolve, facilitated by constant combat stress and the ever-present machine spirits that the Mechanicus insists are just algorithms and software, but which sometimes seem like something more aware, more hungry, more willing to accept offerings of human consciousness in exchange for continued operational effectiveness. My hand rested on the warm spot, and I wondered if the previous commander had started having these thoughts around day 3. If he'd touched this spot and felt the same recognition I was feeling, the understanding that a Leman Russ wasn't just a vehicle but an organism, something that consumed crews the way a fire consumes fuel, leaving behind only heat and memory pressed into metal. We didn't reach our objective that day. The company lagged early, commanders gathering for a briefing, while the crews performed hasty maintenance and tried not to think about what we'd seen in the fog. I stayed in my cupola, declined the briefing invitation, claimed I needed to supervise ammunition resupply and damage assessment. Really, I just couldn't bring myself to climb out. The cupola had become familiar in 3 days, comfortable in a way that defied its objective discomfort. The 8 vision blocks showed me a world I could understand, reduced and simplified. Outside, beyond the armor glass, the world had revealed itself to be something my training hadn't prepared me to process. Inside the cupola, I could still pretend I was just a commander leading a crew through difficult but explicable circumstances. Outside, I'd have to face other commanders who'd also seen what we'd seen, and we'd have to either acknowledge it, which would lead to questions neither doctrine nor faith could answer, or pretend together that we'd simply fought captured enemy vehicles, and the pretense would be worse than the truth, because it would require active, conscious lying rather than just willful blindness. So I stayed, sat in the command seat through the night watch rotations, hand on the warm spot, feeling it pulse in rhythm with something that might have been my heartbeat or might have been something else entirely. And when I finally slept, slumped in the seat with my head against the cupola's padding, I dreamed of previous commanders, a chain of men stretching back through years of combat, all sitting in this same seat, all touching this same warm spot, all feeling the same recognition that the tank was remembering them, incorporating them, making them part of its collective memory. In the dream, they welcomed me, told me I was doing well, told me I'd last longer than most, told me that by day 40, I'd understand everything. I woke at dawn, or what passed for dawn, with the taste of copper on my tongue and a new understanding settling into my bones. The tank wasn't just remembering its previous crews. It was learning from them. Each commander added to its knowledge, taught it new things about human behavior, human breaking points, human flexibility in the face of impossible conditions. And in return, the tank offered something: the ability to function past the point where a human should collapse, to make decisions that ignored empathy and morality in favor of pure operational effectiveness. It was a trade: consciousness for capability, humanity for survival, and I'd already begun paying the price. Day 7. We'd been on the move for almost a week, and the objective kept receding, always another 20 kilometers forward, always just beyond the next ridgeline or through the next engagement zone. The company was down to 11 tanks from the original 20. Replacement vehicles and crews trickled in occasionally, fresh from orbital deployment, crewed by men and women who still thought war was something comprehensible. They died fastest, not from lack of skill, but from lack of understanding. They still saw the enemy as people to be defeated, rather than problems to be solved. They still hesitated when faced with decisions that required choosing between bad options and worse ones. They still believed their humanity mattered in the context of armored warfare. I'd stopped making those mistakes. My decisions came faster now, cleaner, unencumbered by moral consideration. When a friendly infantry unit called for support during an enemy assault, I calculated ammunition expenditure against likelihood of successful defense and declined the request when the math didn't favor intervention. When a damaged tank from our company requested covering fire to facilitate crew evacuation, I assessed that maintaining formation and avoiding engagement was tactically superior to risking our position for soldiers who were operationally unsalvageable. The company commissar would have called it ruthless efficiency. The old me would have called it something else. "Sir," Vaughn said on day 7, his voice carrying a note I couldn't quite identify. "Permission to speak freely?" We were lagered, conducting maintenance, other crews visible through the vision blocks as they moved around their vehicles. I'd been in the cupola for how long? Days. I'd stopped climbing out, except when absolutely necessary for bodily functions, and even those I delayed as long as possible. "Granted," I said. "You're changing, sir. The crew has noticed. Hell, the whole company has noticed. You haven't left the tank in 4 days. You're making decisions that—" He paused, searching for words. "That aren't wrong." "Exactly. But they're cold. Calculated. Like you're running probability matrices instead of commanding soldiers. Effective command requires objective assessment of tactical situations. Effective command also requires maintaining crew morale and demonstrating care for the soldiers under your authority," Vaughn countered. "Sir, with respect, when was the last time you asked how any of us were doing? Not operational status, actually asked?" I tried to remember and couldn't. The crew had become functions to me: gunner, loader, driver, sponson operator. Their emotional states mattered only insofar as they affected combat performance. When Dace had started talking to the shells, muttering prayers and endearments to the ammunition he loaded, I'd noted it as a potential red flag but taken no action because his loading speed remained within acceptable parameters. When Kels had stopped responding to orders with anything except the bare minimum acknowledgement, I'd categorized it as acceptable communication efficiency rather than recognizing it as the warning sign of psychological breakdown. "The crew is functional," I said. "That's what matters." "Functional," Vaughn repeated, and there was something like grief in his voice. "Sir, Dace is having conversations with the shells. Merrick flinches every time the Auspex pings, even when it's just scanning returns. Kells hasn't spoken a voluntary word in 3 days, just confirms orders and drives. And you're sitting in that cupola, treating us like servitors, like we're just components of the tank rather than people, because that's what keeps us alive," I snapped, feeling something crack inside me, some barrier I'd built between the part that gave orders and the part that remembered being human. You want me to care about your feelings. You want me to check in and ask how you're processing the horror we're swimming through every day? Fine. I care. You're all breaking down psychologically, exhibiting symptoms of combat stress and probable PTSD, and under normal circumstances I'd recommend rotation to rear echelon and psychiatric evaluation. But these aren't normal circumstances. We're in an active combat zone with no relief rotation schedule, and the only thing that matters is whether you can still perform your functions inside this tank. Can you? Silence. Then, quietly. Yes, sir. Then we're done with this conversation. Return to your station. Varn climbed down, and I was alone again in the cupola, hand pressed against the warm spot, feeling it pulse with something like satisfaction. The tank approved of my reasoning. The tank understood that survival required sacrifice, that maintaining humanity was a luxury we couldn't afford. The previous commander had understood too, eventually. They all had. That's why they'd touched this spot, seeking comfort from the only thing that understood what they'd become. That night, day 7, night watch, 0200 hours, I heard music. Faint, barely audible over the engine idle and the Vox static, but definitely music. A melody that seemed to come from the metal itself, from the spaces between the armor layers where nothing human-sized could fit. It wasn't beautiful, it was discordant, atonal, the kind of sound that hurt if you listened too long. But it was also oddly compelling, drawing attention the way certain types of pain can be fascinating. Do you hear that? I asked over the internal Vox. Hear what, sir? Merrick responded from his gunner's station. Never mind. I keyed off the Vox. Either I was the only one hearing it, or the crew had learned not to acknowledge the things we saw and heard inside the tank that doctrine said couldn't exist. The Imperium didn't recognize hauntings, after all. Only machine spirits and the Emperor's divine will. I listened to the music for another hour, trying to identify the melody, trying to understand what the tank was attempting to communicate. Because it was communication, I was certain of that now. The metal wasn't just holding memory, it was actively reaching out, attempting to bridge the gap between its machine awareness and my human consciousness. What did a tank want? What did it need beyond fuel and ammunition and maintenance? What was it asking for when it sang discordant melodies in the dead of night? The answer, when it came, was obvious and terrible. It wanted crew. Not just any crew, integrated crew, bonded crew. Humans willing to blur the boundaries between flesh and metal until neither could exist without the other. It wanted me to stop being Commander Crane, who happened to operate inside a Leman Russ, and start being the consciousness that moved through the tank's frame, thinking with its auspex, seeing through its vision blocks, firing through its guns, until there was no meaningful distinction between biological neural tissue and electronic circuitry. It wanted what all the previous commanders had eventually given it, complete subsumption. And the terrifying part was that it felt less like a threat and more like an invitation, a promise of release from the burden of making impossible decisions, from the weight of commanding soldiers I couldn't save through situations I couldn't control. Just surrender to the tank. Let it make the decisions. Become the voice that spoke coordinates and authorized fire missions, while the thing that used to be Thaddeus Crane faded into the background like an echo in a large room. No, I whispered to the metal. Not yet. The music stopped. The warm spot cooled by perhaps a degree, not much, just enough to communicate disappointment. But it could wait. It had waited through previous commanders, through years of war. It could wait for me to reach the inevitable conclusion all its commanders reached, that humanity was the price of survival, and inside a Leman Russ, survival was all that remained. Day 10 arrived with new orders. Advance to strategic position Gamma 7, which had somehow remained out of reach despite a week of continuous movement. The Vox briefing included new tactical intelligence. The enemy was regrouping, preparing defenses, establishing positions that would require frontal assault to dislodge. High casualties expected, acceptable losses anticipated. The usual euphemisms that meant we were about to drive into hell and hope enough of us came out the other side to claim victory. Load armor piercing, I ordered as we rolled out. Full combat ready. Merrick, keep the Auspex in active mode, despite the detection risk. I want every available second of warning before contact. Understood, sir, Merrick replied, his voice hollow, all the personality bleached out by a week of continuous combat stress. He'd stopped praying over the targeting solutions, stopped second-guessing. Just acquired targets, calculated firing solutions, waited for my authorization, and fired when ordered, exactly as efficient as a servitor, with the bonus of still technically being human. Dace loaded shells with the obsessive care of someone handling religious relics, which, in a sense, he was each round blessed by the Mechanicus, consecrated for the Emperor's service, destined to bring death to his enemies. He'd started naming them. I'd heard him whispering Martyr's Blessing as he loaded one, Throne's Judgment as he loaded another. As long as he kept loading at acceptable speed, I didn't care if he composed epic poetry for each shell. Kells drove in silence, as always. Sometimes I wondered if he'd broken completely, if the consciousness behind those control levers had simply shut down and been replaced by some sort of automatic response system that mimicked human behavior without actually requiring human awareness. Other times I heard him weeping in the night watches and knew he was still in there somewhere, still suffering, still trapped in that narrow driver's compartment with nothing but a vision slit and endless terrain scrolling past. And Vaughn maintained the sponson bolter, performed maintenance, rotated through crew positions as needed, and watched me with eyes that held something between concern and horror. He knew what was happening. He could see the transformation, even if he couldn't articulate it. The commander he'd met 10 days ago was being replaced by something else, something that wore my face and spoke with my voice but had stopped processing the world through human frameworks. We made contact at 1100 hours. Not an ambush, this time a prepared defensive position, exactly as the intelligence had indicated. Trenches, bunkers, pre-targeted artillery coordinates, the full array of anti-tank measures. The kind of engagement where doctrine had clear answers: suppressive fire, covered advance, combined arms coordination with infantry and air support. Except we had no infantry, no air support. Just 11 tanks being ordered to conduct a frontal assault against prepared positions because strategic position Gamma 7 was somehow critical to the war effort in ways we weren't cleared to understand. All call signs, advance by bounds, alternate movement and covering fire. Maintain spacing. Expect heavy resistance. The first tank died within 30 seconds of entering the engagement zone. Direct hit from a las cannon, probably hull-mounted in one of the bunkers, perfectly positioned to catch the exposed lower glacis plate. The tank cooked off immediately, ammunition detonating in a chain reaction that threw the turret clear and left the hull burning with flames that reached 20 meters high. Left bound, execute. Right bound, cover fire. We were the right bound. I ordered Merrick to fire at anything that looked like a defensive position, while the left-bound tanks advanced 50 meters, stopped, and became the covering element while we moved. Leapfrog tactics, designed to minimize exposure, maintain momentum, keep the enemy suppressed. It worked for maybe 5 minutes. Then the artillery started not random harassment fire, but precisely targeted, time-on-target salvos that hit the engagement zone with mathematical precision. 2 more tanks died in the first barrage. 3 more were damaged, track blown, turret jammed, crews potentially intact, but vehicles immobilized. All call signs push through. Do not stop for disabled vehicles. Standard doctrine. Brutal doctrine. Necessary doctrine. The tanks that stopped to assist disabled comrades became disabled themselves. The only way through a kill zone was speed and violence, accepting casualties as inevitable overhead. We advanced through hell. The vision blocks showed me a world of fire and smoke and explosions that turned dirt into shrapnel and air into pressure waves. The targeting display was useless, too much heat, too much interference. The Auspex overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming fire. We fired blind, main gun and sponson bolter, putting out rounds in the general direction of enemy positions, hoping volume would compensate for accuracy. Something hit us. Not a killing shot, the angle was wrong, the round glancing off our frontal armor with a screech that made my teeth ache, but it hit hard enough to rock the tank, hard enough to throw Merrick against his gunner's station with force I heard even through the internal bulkheads. Crew report. Driver operational, Kell said, his voice mechanical. Loader operational, Dace confirmed, though I could hear pain in his voice. Gunner is. I'm okay, sir. Targeting system is down. Switching to manual sights. Sponson functional, Vaughn added. We'd lost our advanced targeting, but we were still mobile, still armed, still in the fight. Around us, the rest of the company pushed forward through the kill zone, each tank choosing between speed and caution, between aggressive engagement and defensive maneuvering. Some chose right and survived. Some chose wrong and died. The only common factor was that staying still was fatal. We broke through the defensive line at 1,147 hours. 47 minutes of sustained combat that felt like years. 6 tanks had made it through. 6 from 11, 11 from 20. The company eroding like a sandstone cliff under wave assault, but we'd taken the position. Strategic position Gamma 7 was ours, for whatever that meant, whatever strategic value it held, that was worth 3/4 of a tank company. We lagered in what had been the enemy's rear area, now just more scorched terrain indistinguishable from every other piece of this blighted world. Sir, Vaughn said, and his voice made me look down from the cupola for the first time in days. He was standing beside the tank, looking up at me, and what I saw in his face made something cold settle in my chest. Sir, you need to come down. You need to see this. Crew report said everyone was operational. Operational isn't the same as okay. Please, sir, come down. I climbed out of the cupola, an action that felt foreign, muscles stiff from days of immobility, sunlight, or the grey twilight that passed for it, painful after so long viewing the world through armor-glass tinting. My legs nearly buckled when they took my full weight. How long had it been since I'd stood? Vaughn led me around the tank to the sponson position, showed me the scoring on the armor where the glancing shot had hit, showed me how the impact had transmitted through the hull plating, showed me the sponson interior where Dace had been loading shells when the impact happened. There was blood. Not much, but enough. A spray pattern on the shell racks where Dace's head had hit when the impact threw him. He'd kept loading, kept functioning, reported operational status despite probable concussion because that's what the tank required. He needs medical evacuation, Vaughn said. So does Merrick. I saw him coughing blood after he hit the gunner's station. Kells hasn't responded to verbal communication in 2 days, except to confirm orders. Sir, the crew is breaking down. We're all breaking down. And you're. He gestured at the cupola. You haven't left that seat in almost a week. When was the last time you ate? Slept in an actual bunk? Stood in open air? I tried to remember and couldn't. Time in the cupola had ceased to flow normally. Watch rotations blurred together. Day and night, distinguished only by slight changes in the vision block lighting. I'd been eating ration bars without tasting them, sleeping in minute increments, existing in a state that was neither awake nor truly asleep, but some third condition, where consciousness persisted at minimum necessary levels. I'm functional, I said, and heard how my voice had changed, how it had flattened into the same mechanical tone Kells used. You're becoming like the tank, Vaughn said quietly. I've seen it before. With other commanders who lasted too long. You stop being human and start being just. The voice that gives orders. The awareness that operates the weapons. You're merging with it, sir. And if you don't pull back now, there won't be enough of you left to pull back. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I was still myself, still Commander Thaddeus Crane, operating a machine, rather than a machine operating through a body that used to be Thaddeus Crane, but standing in the open air, feeling wind that wasn't filtered through recyclers, seeing the tank from outside rather than from within. I could see what he meant. Imperator's fist had changed. The paint was scarred, yes, but that was normal. What wasn't normal was the way the scars seemed to have patterns, seemed to form designs that hurt to look at too long. The way the metal seemed slightly warmer than ambient temperature even in areas far from the engine. The way the cupola hatch looked less like an entrance and more like a mouth, waiting to swallow me back down into the comfortable darkness, where decisions were simple and humanity was just noise that interfered with operational effectiveness. Get the crew to the company Medicae, I ordered. Full evaluation. What? What would I do? Standing outside the tank felt wrong, exposed, like I'd removed necessary protection. I'll conduct external inspection and damage assessment. Sir, that's an order, Sergeant. Vaughn looked at me for a long moment, then saluted and moved off, gathering the crew, leading them toward the company aid station. I watched them go Dace, walking with careful steps that suggested his balance was compromised. Merrick moving slowly and holding his ribs. Kels following in silence with eyes that didn't seem to register his surroundings. Then I turned back to the tank. My tank. The machine that had become more home than any physical structure I'd ever inhabited. I walked around it, hand trailing along the armor plating, feeling the warmth radiating through the ceramite. The metal seemed to respond to my touch, seemed to recognize me, seemed to welcome me back to where I belonged. The warm spot on the interior cupola was calling. I could feel it even from outside, even through the armor layers. It wanted me back, needed me back, because the tank and I were bonding, becoming integrated, reaching the point where neither could function optimally without the other. And the terrifying part was how much I wanted to climb back in, how much I wanted to return to the cupola's familiar darkness, to the simplified world of the vision blocks, to the state where I didn't have to think about my crew as people because they were just functions, components, necessary elements of the war machine that was consuming all of us. Not yet, I told the tank, told myself. Not yet. But I knew it was lying. I knew that the moment Vaughn and the crew returned from the Medicae, I'd climb back into the cupola. Back to the warm spot. Back to the comfortable process of dissolution that would leave me integrated with the tank's consciousness, another ghost pressed into the metal, another memory adding to the collective knowledge that made Imperator's fist more than just a machine. The tank could wait. It had infinite patience. And it knew, with the certainty of accumulated experience, that I would return. They always did. Every commander reached the point where outside the tank felt wrong, felt exposed, felt like exile from the only place that truly understood what they'd become. I sat on the tank's glacis plate, armor warm against my legs, and waited for my crew to return so I could climb back into the darkness and continue the transformation. I was no longer certain I wanted to resist. Day 15. We'd been rotating crews not because I'd requested it, but because the company commander had issued a blanket order after the Medicae reported that 3/4 of the company's tank commanders were showing signs of dissociative disorders and were in danger of becoming combat ineffective. Forced rotations, 4 hours in the tank, 2 hours out. It was supposed to help us maintain perspective, remember we were human, prevent the complete psychological deterioration that led to commanders being found dead in their cupolas, hands frozen on controls, having forgotten that living required more than just operational effectiveness. I hated every second outside the tank. The 2-hour breaks felt like exile, like being separated from a necessary part of myself. I'd sit in the company area, surrounded by other crews, and feel their eyes on me, feel their unspoken judgment. Look at Crane, they thought but didn't say. Look at what happens when you stay in too long. Look at what he's becoming. But inside the tank, during those 4-hour duty periods, everything made sense. The vision blocks showed me a comprehensible world. The crew functioned as extensions of my will. The warm spot pulsed against my hand like a heartbeat, and I felt connected to something larger than my individual consciousness. The accumulated experience of every commander who'd sat in this seat, made these decisions, faced these impossible choices. We'd received 3 replacement crew members over the past week. 2 had lasted a single combat action before requesting transfer. The 3rd had made it 4 days before the Medicae evacuated him after he was found trying to merge with the ammunition racks, convinced he could make the shells more accurate if he could just become part of the loading mechanism. The originals Varn, Merrick, Dace, Kells remained, not because they were more resilient, but because they'd passed some threshold beyond which transfer was meaningless. They'd already begun the same transformation I was experiencing. Dace now spent his off hours sitting next to the tank, hand pressed against the hull, listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. Merrick had stopped sleeping entirely, just sat at the gunner's station during breaks, eyes closed, running firing solutions in his head. Kells had started referring to the driver's compartment as home, and seemed genuinely distressed when forced to leave it. And Varn had stopped warning me about the changes, stopped trying to pull me back from the edge. He'd recognized that the edge wasn't a cliff but a slope, and we were all sliding down it together, and the only question was whether we'd hit bottom before the war killed us. Commander Crane, the company commissar, appeared beside the tank during one of my forced rest periods. Commissar Thorne, a man whose face seemed designed by committee to represent authority, all hard angles and skeptical eyes. Report. I climbed down from where I'd been sitting on the glacis plate, close to the metal, feeling its warmth seeping into my legs. Imperator's fist is operational, sir. Combat effectiveness at 85%, despite ongoing mechanical issues. Crew is functional within acceptable parameters. That's not what I asked for. Thorne stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the recaf on his breath, see the way his hand rested casually near his bolt pistol. I asked for your report, Commander, not the tank's status. Yours. It took me a moment to understand the distinction he was making. When had I started reporting vehicle status when asked about myself? When had my identity become so merged with the tank that separating my condition from its condition required conscious effort? I'm operational, sir, I said, and even I could hear how wrong that sounded, how it was the kind of response a servitor might give. Thorne studied me for a long moment. Then, you're being rotated to rear echelon for psychological evaluation. Effective immediately. Sergeant Varn will assume command of Imperator's fist. The words hit me like a physical blow. Rotated out. Separated from the tank. Taken away from the warm spot and the vision blocks, and the comfortable darkness where I didn't have to be human, just operational. Sir, I respectfully request to remain with my crew. The company is below strength. Command continuity is essential for maintaining combat effectiveness, and you've forgotten how to talk like a person. Thorne interrupted. Listen to yourself, Commander. You sound like you're reading from a tactical manual. When was the last time you had a conversation that wasn't about ammunition loads or targeting solutions? I tried to remember, and couldn't. Conversations had become exchanges of necessary operational information. Efficiency. Everything reduced to essential data. The evaluation is standard procedure, Thorne continued. 3 days in the rear, full psychological battery, then we determine if you're fit to return to duty. This isn't a punishment, Commander. It's an attempt to save what's left of the man I'm told used to exist before you climbed into that cupola. And if I refuse? Thorn's hand moved fractionally closer to his bolt pistol. Then I execute you for dereliction of duty and combat ineffectiveness, and we assign a replacement commander who hopefully lasts longer than 3 weeks before becoming a meat servitor that thinks in nothing but tactical calculus. His voice softened slightly. You're good at this, Crane. Too good. That's the problem. You're so effective at commanding armor that you've forgotten you're supposed to stay human while doing it. 3 days. That's all I'm asking. 3 days to remember what you're fighting for. What was I fighting for? The question felt foreign, irrelevant. I fought because the orders came through the Vox. I fired because targets appeared on the Auspex. I advanced because that was the directive. Purpose beyond operational parameters seemed like a luxury from another life. But Thorn was right, I realized with sudden clarity. Not about saving me, that was probably already impossible, but about preserving combat effectiveness. A commander who'd forgotten why war mattered beyond tactical objectives was a commander who'd make decisions optimized for vehicle survival rather than mission success. Eventually, I'd become a liability, choosing tank preservation over accomplishing objectives, prioritizing my merged consciousness with Imperator's fist over the actual purpose of fighting. 3 days, sir, I confirmed. Then I returned to my crew. If the evaluation clears you, yes. I climbed back onto the tank just one last moment, just to say goodbye, and pressed my hand against the hull plating. The metal warmed under my palm, and I felt something like protest, like the tank recognizing what was happening and objecting. We'd been bonding, integrating, becoming something new, and now that process was being interrupted. I'll be back, I whispered to the metal. I promise. The warmth pulsed 3 times. Acknowledgement, agreement, or perhaps warning that once separated, the bond might break completely, leaving me stranded in human consciousness without the comfortable framework the tank provided. Varn found me that evening as I was preparing to board the transport that would take me to rear echelon. He looked tired, older than his years, worn down by 2 weeks of continuous combat in an environment that ground men down to components. Don't come back, he said quietly. I stared at him. What? Don't come back, sir. Take the evaluation, fail it if you have to, get assigned to some safe training position or administrative role. Because, if you come back to this tank, he gestured at Imperator's fist, sitting in the ledger like a sleeping predator. If you come back, you'll finish what you started. You'll complete the merger. And then there won't be anything left of Thaddeus Crane, except a voice, giving orders, and a hand, touching that warm spot in the cupola. The crew needs continuity. You said yourself that the crew needs to remember we're human, Varn interrupted, and they can't do that if their commander has forgotten. You've been our example, sir. We've been following your lead, and your lead has been straight into whatever hell that tank represents. He stepped closer. I've looked at the maintenance logs. Imperator's fist is older than the records show. It's been in continuous combat for 40 years. 40 years, sir. How many crews do you think have died inside it? How many commanders have touched that warm spot and felt what you felt? The machine spirit is strong, I said automatically. The tech priests say. The tech priests don't know what they're talking about. Or they do know, and they're not telling us, because the Imperium needs tanks more than it needs commanders who stay sane. Varn's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That tank is eating you, consuming you, adding you to whatever collection of ghosts it's already holding. And if you get back in that cupola, if you put your hand on that warm spot again, you won't have the strength to resist anymore. He was right. I knew he was right. But the thought of not going back, of abandoning the tank, of breaking the bond we'd been forming, felt like contemplating amputation. The tank was part of me now, or I was part of it. The distinction had become meaningless. 3 days, I said. Then we'll see what the evaluation determines. Vaughn looked at me with something like pity. You're going to pass it, aren't you? You're going to tell them exactly what they want to hear. Perform exactly how they expect. Do everything necessary to get cleared for duty. Because you can't imagine not going back. Because my crew needs me, I corrected. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't quite accurate. My crew would adapt to a new commander. They'd be fine, or at least, they'd be no worse than they already were. No, the truth was simpler and more horrifying. I needed the tank, needed the cupola's darkness, needed the warm spot's pulse, needed the simplified worldview where everything reduced to operational parameters and tactical decisions. Outside the tank, I was drowning in complexity, overwhelmed by the weight of choices that required moral reasoning I'd forgotten how to perform. Inside the tank, I was just the commander, just the voice and the hand, just the awareness that moved through metal bones and electronic nerves, thinking in firing solutions and movement coordinates. Just a ghost in the making, learning to haunt my own coffin before I'd finished dying. The transport left at dawn. I watched through the rear window as the company ledger receded into the distance. Watched until I couldn't distinguish Imperator's fist from the other tanks. Watched until the whole war zone was just a grey smudge on a grey horizon under grey skies that wept acid rain. 3 days. That's what Thorne had said. 3 days to remember humanity. But I already knew how this would end. Knew that I'd pass the evaluation because I was still functional enough to mimic normal human responses when required. Knew that I'd volunteer to return to duty because the alternative was worse than death. It was existence without purpose, without the framework the tank provided, without the comfortable dissolution of identity that made the war bearable. In 3 days, I'd climb back into that cupola, press my hand against that warm spot, feel the metal welcome me home, and by day 40, I'd understand everything, just as the dream had promised, just as all the previous commanders had understood when they finally completed their transformation and became one with the machine that had consumed them. The rear echelon was a different world. Clean, organized, full of people who performed their duties without the constant background radiation of imminent death. Support personnel, logistics officers, medical staff, all moving through their routines with the kind of casual inefficiency that would have gotten them killed in a combat zone, but which here seemed almost luxurious. I spent 3 days there, undergoing the psychological evaluation, talking to Medicaid personnel who asked questions designed to assess my mental fitness, performing cognitive tests, submitting to interviews where they tried to determine if I was still capable of functioning as an Imperial Guard officer or if I'd degraded into something that needed to be quietly retired from service. I passed. Of course I passed. I understood what they were looking for, understood the responses that would indicate fitness for duty. I could still mimic humanity well enough to fool people who'd never experienced the kind of integration I'd achieved with Imperator's fist. They saw a tired commander, stressed by combat, needing rest. They didn't see the thing beneath the surface, the growing awareness that existed partially in flesh and partially in steel, that thought in targeting solutions even when answering questions about childhood memories. You're cleared for return to duty, Commander Crane, the evaluation officer told me on the morning of day 18. However, I'm recommending continued monitoring and mandatory rest periods. Your responses indicate high stress but not disqualifying trauma. The forced separation from your crew and vehicle appears to have provided necessary perspective. Perspective, that's what they called it. The ability to remember I was supposed to be human rather than just operational. The capacity to perform social interactions that weren't just exchanges of tactical data, but underneath that layer of performed humanity, I could feel the hunger, the need to return to the tank, to the cupola, to the warm spot that pulsed with recognition and welcome. 3 days away had felt like 3 years, every hour stretching into eternity while I existed in an unwanted state of separation. They put me on a transport back to the company that same day. I sat in the crew compartment, surrounded by replacement personnel heading to the front, young soldiers with clean uniforms and untested optimism. They talked among themselves, nervous chatter about what combat would be like, whether they'd measure up, whether they'd survive. I said nothing, just sat and waited and felt the distance closing between me and Imperator's fist. Felt the pull of the bond we'd been forming getting stronger as kilometers disappeared beneath the transport's treads. The company Leger came into view at dusk on day 19. 18 days since I'd first climbed into the cupola. 19 days since I'd been promoted to tank commander and given the greatest honor the Imperial Guard could bestow, command of a Leman Russ battle tank. It felt like years, decades, lifetimes, compressed into days. Vaughn met me at the transport. He looked worse than when I'd left, new scars on his face, a bandage wrapped around his left arm, eyes that held the kind of exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. "You came back," he said, and there was no surprise in his voice. Just resignation. Confirmation of something he'd already known was inevitable. "The crew needs continuity," I replied. "The official reason. The acceptable justification. The crew needs." Vaughn trailed off, shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Imperator's fist is over there." He pointed toward the Leger line. "She's been waiting for you. We all have." I walked toward my tank, and with each step I felt the bond reforming, strengthening, pulling me back into integration. The other crews I passed looked at me with expressions ranging from pity to understanding to envy. Pity from those who thought I was walking to my doom, understanding from those who knew what the tank offered, envy from those who hadn't yet found that kind of connection with their own vehicles. Imperator's fist sat exactly as I'd left her. Same parking position, same scars on the armor plating, same warm presence radiating from the hull. I pressed my hand against the glacis plate and felt the metal respond, felt it recognize me, felt it welcome me home with something like joy. "I'm back," I whispered. "I'm sorry I left." The metal pulsed with forgiveness, with understanding, with the certainty that separation had always been temporary, that our bond was inevitable, that I'd always been destined to complete the transformation that had begun the moment I'd first touched the warm spot in the cupola. I climbed up the hull, moved to the cupola hatch, paused for just one moment before dropping inside. This was the choice point, the moment where I could still turn back, still choose humanity over integration, still preserve some core of Thaddeus Crane that existed independently of the tank. But even as I recognized the choice, I knew I'd already made it. Had made it 19 days ago when I'd first felt the warm spot's pulse. Had made it when I'd chosen operational effectiveness over empathy, when I'd prioritized the tank's survival over the crew's humanity, when I'd started thinking in firing solutions and targeting parameters instead of moral frameworks. I dropped into the cupola, settled into the command seat, pressed my hand against the warm spot on the left side near the vision block, and felt something click into place, like a lock engaging, like a circuit completing, like two pieces that had always been meant to join finally making contact. The tank sighed, or I sighed. The distinction was becoming academic. "Welcome home, Commander," the metal seemed to whisper, though the voice might have been my own thoughts reflected back through the bond. "Let's finish what we started." Days 20 through 35 blurred together into a continuous stream of combat operations that I navigated with increasing efficiency and decreasing humanity. The forced rest periods that Commissar Thorne had mandated became jokes. I'd climb out of the cupola for the required 2 hours, sit next to the tank with my hand pressed against the hull, and count seconds until I could climb back in. The crew stopped trying to maintain normal human interactions. We communicated in tactical shorthand, in coordinates and status reports, in the clipped language of pure operational effectiveness. Dace named every shell he loaded, whispered prayers to ammunition that had become more real to him than people. Merrick sat at his gunner's station with eyes that didn't blink, targeting solutions running through his brain in endless calculations. Kells drove in absolute silence, merged with his controls, to the point where the distinction between man and machine had ceased to have meaning. And Varn had stopped warning me, stopped trying to pull any of us back. He'd recognized that we'd passed the point of no return, that the only direction left was forward, deeper into integration, further from whatever we'd been before the tank had claimed us. We were the most effective tank in the company. Our kill count exceeded any other vehicles by a factor of 3. We never missed fire missions, never hesitated on target selection, never wasted ammunition on low-probability engagements. We moved through combat operations with the kind of precision that made other crews look clumsy by comparison. We were also dying. Not physically, the tank's armor still held, the engine still ran, the weapons still fired. But the 5 humans operating Imperator's fist were dissolving, personality and identity, and humanity bleeding away into the metal, until we were just functions, just components, just the awareness that moved through the tank's frame and thought its thoughts and wanted its desires. On day 32, we received orders to assault a fortified position that 3 previous tank companies had failed to crack. The objective was a bunker complex built into a hillside, covered approaches, interlocking fields of fire, the kind of target that ate armor and spit out wreckage. All call signs. "This is a priority objective," the company commander's voice crackled over the vox. "Frontal assault, maximum aggression. Expect total losses, but the position must be taken. Total losses. Acceptable sacrifice." The mathematics of war reduced to simple calculus. "Imperator's fist acknowledges," I responded. Not, "Commander Crane acknowledges" anymore. The distinction was no longer relevant. We'll break the position. And we did. Not because we were more skilled than the previous companies, but because we'd stopped caring about survival. The tank drove straight at the bunker complex, taking hits that should have disabled us, burning through ammunition with the certainty that either we'd destroy the objective or we'd die trying, and there was no meaningful difference between the 2 outcomes. Kells drove into direct fire without flinching. Merrick acquired targets and fired with mechanical precision even as impacts rocked the tank and filled the crew compartment with smoke. Dace loaded shells, while blood ran from his ears, ruptured eardrums from overpressure, because hearing was optional, but loading was mandatory. Varn fired the sponson bolter until the barrel glowed red-hot and the weapon seized, then grabbed a lasgun and continued firing through the vision ports. And I sat in the cupola, hand on the warm spot, feeling the tank's joy as we crashed through obstacles and broke defenses and proved that nothing could stop us because we'd transcended the limitations that held normal crews back. We'd become pure function, pure operational effectiveness, pure war distilled into 5 human-shaped components, operating a machine that had stopped being just metal and started being alive. We took the objective, destroyed the bunker complex, eliminated every defensive position, and when we rolled back to friendly lines, trailing smoke and leaking fluids from a dozen different damage points, the other crews looked at us with expressions that mixed awe and horror. "They're not human anymore," I heard someone whisper as we passed. "Look at their eyes. They're already dead, just waiting for the tank to stop moving so they can finish dying." They were wrong. We weren't dead. We were more alive than we'd ever been, merged with a purpose larger than individual survival, integrated into something that would continue long after our bodies failed. The tank would remember us, add us to its collection, make us part of the lineage of ghosts that would guide future commanders down the same path we'd walked. Day 38 brought strategic position Gamma 7 back into our mission queue. After 38 days of continuous combat, after burning through 3 tank companies and probably 10,000 infantry, The Imperium was finally mounting a coordinated assault on the objective that had started this whole campaign. "This is it," the company commander announced in the briefing which I attended via Vox, while sitting in my cupola, because leaving the tank for a physical briefing seemed wasteful and unnecessary. "Final push. We take Gamma 7 or we die trying. No retreat, no surrender. For the Emperor, for the Emperor," the assembled commanders responded. But I heard the hollowness in their voices, the recognition that this was a suicide mission dressed up in doctrine and faith. We were going to die, all of us. The only question was whether we'd accomplish the objective first. I should have felt fear, should have felt grief for the life I was about to lose, should have felt something human in the face of imminent death. But sitting in the cupola, hand on the warm spot, feeling the tank's eagerness to fulfill its purpose, I felt nothing but satisfaction. This was what we'd been preparing for. This was why the integration had been necessary. So that when the moment came, when death became inevitable, we could face it without hesitation or doubt or human weakness. "Crew," I said over the internal Vox. "Final preparations. Check all systems. Load for maximum combat effectiveness. This is what we trained for." "Understood, Commander," came the responses. 4 voices that sounded alike now, that had lost their individual characteristics and merged into a collective tone that might as well have been coming from different mouths of the same entity. We rolled out at dawn on day 39. 11 tanks from what had once been a full company. 11 machines moving in formation toward an objective we'd been chasing since day 1. The terrain had changed, more broken now, more cratered, evidence of the sustained combat that had chewed up the landscape and spit it out in unrecognizable fragments. The approach to strategic position Gamma 7 was a killing field. Open ground, no cover, every meter pre-targeted by enemy artillery. We advanced at maximum speed, accepting that casualties were inevitable, that survival was unlikely, that the only thing that mattered was reaching the objective. The first tank died at 0612 hours. Direct hit from a bunker-mounted las cannon. The second died 4 minutes later, track blown by a mine, immobilized and burning. By 0630 we were down to 8 tanks, and strategic position Gamma 7 was still 2 kilometers distant. All call signs: maintain formation, do not stop for casualties, push through. We pushed through. Through artillery that turned the air itself into shrapnel, through minefields that erupted under our treads, through direct fire from weapons that had been positioned and zeroed for exactly this kind of assault. Imperator's fist took hits, lots of hits. The armor held barely, but systems were failing. The Auspex flickered and died. The Vox crackled with static that made communication nearly impossible. Something in the engine compartment was making a grinding sound that suggested imminent catastrophic failure, but we kept moving, kept firing, kept advancing, because stopping was death, and advance at least offered purpose. Contact, 12 o'clock, bunker complex. Merrick's call was calm despite the situation, his voice steady despite the fire and smoke filling the crew compartment. "That's the objective, sir. That's Gamma 7. Through the vision blocks I could see it. A massive fortified structure built into the hillside. Weapons bristling from firing ports. Adamantium reinforced walls, designed to withstand anything short of orbital bombardment. The thing we'd been chasing for 39 days. All call signs, final assault. Concentrate fire on the bunker entrance. We're going in. 3 tanks left now. 3 from 20. 3 rolling metal coffins charging toward a position that had already eaten entire companies. But we were going to take it, because that's what we'd been ordered to do, because purpose didn't require survival, because dying while fulfilling our function was preferable to surviving while failing it. The bunker's defensive fire intensified. Las cannons, autocannons, missile launchers, everything converging on the 3 remaining tanks that dared to advance. The tank to our left exploded, hit by something so powerful it simply ceased to exist. The tank to our right ground to a halt, turret frozen, crew probably dead, but the machine still somehow operational through sheer mechanical inertia. Just us now. Just Imperator's fist, advancing alone through fire that should have killed us a dozen times over, surviving through a combination of armor and angle and perhaps something else, something that came from the bond between crew and machine, from the integration we'd achieved that made us more than just a tank. Range to target? I asked, my voice calm despite everything. 200 meters, Merrick replied. I can see the bunker entrance, main gun ready, load armor piercing. Maximum penetration. We're going to punch through that door and drive inside. A moment of silence. Then Dace. Loaded and ready, Commander. We fired the main gun at point-blank range, the shell impacting the bunker entrance at 200 meters and blowing through the reinforced doors in a shower of metal and rockcrete. The explosion cleared a path, created an opening, gave us maybe 30 seconds before the defensive fire adjusted. Kells, full speed, drive straight into that bunker. Acknowledged, Commander. Ramming speed. The tank surged forward, engine screaming with effort that would probably cause catastrophic failure within minutes. But we didn't need minutes. We just needed 30 seconds. 30 seconds to crash through the ruined entrance, to penetrate the bunker, to bring our weapons to bear on the enemy from inside their own fortification. We hit the bunker entrance at 40 kilometers per hour, 60 tons of Imperial armor smashing through broken doors and collapsing walls, grinding over debris and destroyed equipment, forcing our way into the interior through a gap that was barely wide enough to accommodate the tank's width. Inside, chaos. Enemy troops scrambling, defensive positions oriented toward external threats. Everything suddenly vulnerable because we were inside the defense perimeter, inside their safe zone, inside the position they'd thought was impregnable. Sponson, fire at will. Merrick, main gun on anything that looks like a support structure. Dace, keep loading. We're going to bring this whole complex down. The close quarters combat that followed was something between nightmare and ecstasy. The tank fought in spaces it wasn't designed for, grinding through corridors, crushing obstacles, firing into walls and ceilings to cause collapses. The crew operated with perfect synchronization, no hesitation, no doubt, just pure execution of function. We destroyed strategic position Gamma 7 from the inside, methodically, efficiently, with the kind of precision that came from being so completely integrated that we thought and moved and fought as a single entity. When the bunker complex finally collapsed, whether from our actions or from supporting fire, I couldn't determine. We were buried under tons of rockcrete and metal, entombed in the objective we'd been chasing for 40 days. The impact of the collapse threw me against the cupola's restraints. The lights failed. The engine stopped. In the sudden darkness and silence, I could hear the crew breathing, could feel their presence through the bond we'd formed. Crew report, I said into the darkness. Loader, operational, Dace replied, his voice dreamy, distant. Gunner operational, Merrick confirmed. Driver operational, Kells added. Sponson operational, Vaughn finished. We were alive. Trapped, buried, probably entombed permanently, but alive. Mission accomplished, objective taken, purpose fulfilled. Good work, I said. All of you. We did what they said couldn't be done. In the darkness, I pressed my hand against the warm spot. The metal pulsed with something like satisfaction, like pride, like the contentment of purpose achieved. The tank had completed its mission. We'd completed our mission, and now, buried together in the darkness, we could finally rest. Except rest didn't come. Hours passed, I knew, because I could hear my heartbeat, could count the seconds, could track time through the rhythm of my breathing. The crew stayed at their stations, not speaking, just existing in the darkness, waiting. For what? Rescue? Death? Or something else? Sir, Vaughn's voice came through the darkness. Do you think they'll dig us out? Unknown, I replied. Protocol calls for recovery of functional equipment when operationally feasible. We'll see. But I knew we all knew that digging out a buried tank from a collapsed bunker complex in hostile territory wasn't operationally feasible. We'd be left here, buried alive in our metal coffin until the air ran out or the rations depleted or something else killed us. The perfect integration. The final merger. Trapped forever inside the tank that had become our home, our world, our entire existence. Commander, Merrick said, and his voice held something I hadn't heard in weeks, not quite fear, but awareness, recognition of what was happening. Is this what you wanted, when you took command? Did you know it would end like this? No, I admitted, but I'm not sure it matters. We fulfilled our purpose. That's more than most crews get. Purpose, Dace repeated, like he was tasting the word. We named the shells. Did you know that? Every round I loaded had a name, had meaning, had purpose, and now they're gone, fired, used up. Are we the same? Just ammunition that got expended? We're more than ammunition, I said, though I wasn't certain that was true. We're crew. We're the hands and eyes and mind of Imperator's fist. We gave her purpose. She gave us meaning. Gave, Kells said, his first voluntary words in days. Past tense. It's already over, isn't it? We're already dead, just waiting for our bodies to catch up to reality. The darkness pressed close, oppressive, absolute. In the absence of vision blocks and targeting displays, my world had contracted to just this. The command seat, the warm spot under my hand, the presence of my crew in the darkness. Tell me, I said, did any of you regret it? The transformation, becoming what we became. Silence for a long moment. Then Vaughn, no, and that's the most horrifying part. I should regret it, should wish I'd stayed human, stayed separate from the tank, but I don't. This feels right. Feels like where I was always supposed to end up. Same, Merrick agreed. It's like, we found our purpose, and purpose is worth more than humanity. The shells had names, Dace said again, and when they exploded, they fulfilled their purpose. Their names didn't die with them. They're remembered in the destruction they caused. We're the same. We'll be remembered in the metal. The tank remembers, I confirmed, feeling the truth of it through the warm spot's pulse. Everyone who ever crewed her, everyone who ever integrated. We're all here, pressed into the metal, part of the collective memory. And future crews will feel us, will learn from us, will follow the path we walked. So we're immortal, Kell said. Not in body, but in memory, in function, in the ghost we leave behind for others to discover. It was a comforting thought. A lie, probably, or at least an exaggeration. But in the darkness, buried alive in our metal coffin, it was all we had. Day 40 arrived without fanfare, no dawn visible through vision blocks that showed only darkness. No change in the oppressive heat that was building as the crew compartment's temperature climbed without ventilation. Just the recognition, when I checked the chrono's dim glow, that we'd survived long enough to reach the 40-day mark. 40 days. The span of time the previous commander had lasted. The period after which, according to the dream on day 2, I'd understand everything. And I did understand, understood, that a tank wasn't just a machine but a relationship, a merger, a process of mutual consumption, where crew and vehicle devoured each other, and what emerged was something new. Understood that command meant surrendering pieces of yourself until nothing remained except the function, the purpose, the voice that gave orders, and the hand that touched the warm spot. Understood that I'd been dying from the moment I'd first climbed into the cupola, that the transformation wasn't corruption but revelation, wasn't destruction but apotheosis. That Thaddeus Crane had died incrementally over 40 days, replaced by something that was more aware, more effective, more aligned with the fundamental purpose of war. I understand now, I said into the darkness. Why they do it. Why commanders keep taking these positions even though they know what happens. Because it's not a curse. It's a calling. We're not victims of the tank, we're participants in something larger than individual consciousness. The Omnissiah's design, Dace murmured, man and machine, merged into unity. The flesh is weak, but the metal endures. And we endure in the metal, Varn added, after the flesh fails, after breath stops and hearts quit beating. The memory remains, pressed into steel, teaching the next crew what we learned. The heat was becoming unbearable now, temperature climbing toward lethal levels in the sealed, buried tank, oxygen depleting as 5 sets of lungs consumed the limited air supply. I could feel my thoughts beginning to scatter, could feel the biological processes that sustained Thaddeus Crane starting to fail. But the warm spot pulsed steady under my hand. The tank was still alive, still aware, still holding the memories of 40 years and countless crews, still ready to welcome us into its collective consciousness, to make us permanent parts of its being. When they dig us out, I said, words coming slower now as oxygen deprivation and heat exhaustion took their toll. If they dig us out, the next commander who sits in this cupola, they'll feel us here, feel what we learned, understand what we discovered. That command means sacrifice, Merrick said, his voice fading. That purpose matters more than preservation, Dace added. That the boundary between human and machine is negotiable, Kels continued. That the tank remembers, Varn finished. And memory is a kind of immortality. I pressed my hand harder against the warm spot, feeling it respond, feeling the pulse strengthen as my own heartbeat weakened. The metal was warm, welcoming, ready to accept the final offering I'd been preparing over 40 days of incremental dissolution. Imperator's fist, I whispered to the darkness, to the metal, to the accumulated presence of all the previous commanders who'd made this same journey. It's been an honor to serve as your voice. Thank you for accepting me. The warm spot pulsed 3 times. Acknowledgement, acceptance, welcome. Then the darkness became complete. And I felt myself spreading into the metal, consciousness dissipating from failing neurons and being absorbed by something larger, something that would endure beyond biological limitations. My last thought wasn't fear or regret, but satisfaction. The recognition that I'd found my purpose, fulfilled my function, and in doing so, had achieved the only kind of immortality available to those who commanded war machines in the Imperium's eternal crusade. The tank remembered, would always remember, and when future commanders touched the warm spot in the cupola, they'd feel me there, pressed into the metal, whispering coordinates and tactical wisdom, and the fundamental truth I'd learned over 40 brutal days. A Leman Russ isn't a vehicle. It's a tomb that chooses its occupants carefully, selecting those willing to make the ultimate trade: humanity for purpose, consciousness for continuation, the individual self for integration into something that would endure long after flesh had failed. And inside that tomb, surrounded by the ghosts of previous commanders, you didn't live. You endured. You merged. You became the tank, and the tank became you, forever. They found Imperator's fist 6 days after the collapse of Strategic Position Gamma 7 during salvage operations conducted by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The tank was buried under 14 meters of rubble, hull intact, systems mostly functional despite the entombment. When the tech priests opened the cupola, they found Commander Thaddeus Crane still in the command seat, hand pressed against what their instruments recorded as an anomalous heat signature on the interior plating. Dead for approximately 5 days, according to the preliminary assessment. The rest of the crew similarly deceased, each at their station, all showing signs of asphyxiation consistent with oxygen depletion in a sealed environment. The senior tech priest made careful notation in the maintenance logs. Vehicle remains operationally sound despite crew loss. Recommend standard purification rituals and reassignment to replacement crew. Machine spirit appears unusually active, possibly due to recent combat stress. New commander should be carefully selected for compatibility with enhanced machine spirit resonance. The warm spot on the cupola's left interior wall was scrubbed clean, painted over, blessed with unguents and prayers. But the metal underneath remained warm, continued pulsing with a rhythm that matched no mechanical system. Continued waiting for the next commander who would touch it and feel the presence of all those who'd gone before. Imperator's fist returned to service 3 weeks later. The new commander reported that the tank was remarkably responsive, almost intuitive, like it understood what was needed before orders were given. He lasted 37 days before requesting psychiatric evaluation. His replacement lasted 42. The one after that made it to 45 days before being found dead in the cupola, hand pressed against a spot on the interior wall that instruments recorded as inexplicably warm. The tank remembers. The metal holds memory, and in the spaces between armor plates, in the consciousness that emerges from 40 years of continuous warfare, in the accumulated presence of every crew that ever merged with its purpose, there is something that might be called awareness, or hunger, or simply the inevitable price of making war in a universe where survival requires the sacrifice of everything that makes survival worthwhile. 40 days. That's how long it takes for a commander to understand. That's how long it takes for the tank to consume you completely. That's how long it takes to stop being human and start being something else, something that endures beyond flesh, beyond individual consciousness, beyond the fragile boundaries of the self. That's how long it takes to become the ghost that welcomes the next commander, the one who will touch the warm spot and feel your presence there, guiding them down the same path you walked, teaching them the same lessons you learned, preparing them for the same transformation you experienced. Because the tank remembers, and memory is forever, even when the flesh is long gone, even when your name is forgotten, even when nothing remains except the warmth in the metal and the whisper of coordinates in the darkness and the certainty that somewhere another commander is just beginning the journey you completed. 40 days. Can you survive them? The answer is no. But you can endure them. You can merge with them. You can become them. And in becoming, you can achieve the only immortality available to those who command war machines in the eternal darkness of the 41st millennium. The tank remembers. Will you?